The old house was hiding something. Not ghosts, not echoes, something alive, barely clinging to life behind the drywall. But when they pulled her out, they triggered a chain of events that would change everything. Liam couldn't know that his late-night whispers were the only comfort to the creature hidden inside the wall. Olivia had no idea that the man who lived there before them left more than just an empty house. And Detective Wilson certainly couldn't realize that the mystery surrounding Edward Morrison's disappearance was buried right behind those basement walls. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now let's begin. It all started with the softest sound, the kind of sound that most folks would dismiss as a trick of the mind, especially in the quiet, shadowed hours when the world holds its breath between one heartbeat and the next. On that particular night, as the grandfather clock downstairs ticked away the seconds like a patient old man counting memories, 6-year-old Ethan Walker lay restless beneath the weight of his dinosaur print comforter, his wide eyes reflecting the faint glow of the digital clock that blinked 2:17 a.m. in bold red numbers. The old Victorian house, with its high ceilings, creaking floors, and tall windows that whispered stories of generations past, had only recently become the Walkers' home. A grand old place at the edge of Cedar Falls, Oregon, full of history, charm, and secrets still hidden within its aging bones. Ethan had never been one to wake easily, but on that night, something fragile and desperate reached into his dreams and pulled him gently toward consciousness, like a distant hand softly brushing against his cheek, calling him into wakefulness for reasons he could not yet comprehend. The sound came again, a faint whimper, barely louder than a breath, yet unmistakably real to the sensitive ears of a child who seemed to listen not only with his ears, but with something deeper, something closer to the soul. He sat upright in his bed, his tiny hands gripping the blanket as though it were an anchor in a sea of shadows, while his heart began to beat faster, not out of fear, but out of a strange, solemn concern. As he strained his small ears in the darkness, the whimpering returned, a soft, sorrowful cry that seemed to seep through the very walls, as if the house itself was trying to speak, but could only weep in muffled sobs. "Hello," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible, not wanting to disturb the fragile connection he felt was forming between himself and whatever sad creature lay beyond the cold plaster. For a moment, there was silence, as if the thing behind the wall had paused, listening to him, before the soft whimper resumed, this time sounding even more fragile, like a cry for help slowly losing its strength. Sliding carefully from his bed, his little bare feet touched the cool wooden floor, sending a slight shiver up his spine, but still he moved forward, drawn as though by invisible threads to the spot where the sounds seemed most distinct. Pressing his ear gently against the pale floral wallpaper that covered the old wall, Ethan closed his eyes and listened, his breath fogging the surface slightly as he whispered again, "You're stuck, aren't you?" And though no words answered him, the whimper shifted ever so slightly, as though in response, like a flicker of acknowledgement from behind the layers of wood, plaster, and time that separated them. His small fingers traced the seams of the wallpaper, searching for any opening, any crack, any secret door the house might reveal, but finding none, his brow furrowed with the determined seriousness only a child could muster. "I'll help you," he promised softly, his voice steady with conviction. "I won't leave you alone." The first blush of morning light filtered through the kitchen windows downstairs, casting a golden hue over the polished oak table where Susan Walker flipped pancakes with practiced ease, while Michael, her husband, poured steaming coffee into matching ceramic mugs that bore the simple inscription "Home Sweet Home." Their quiet conversation about repainting the front porch and repairing the loose banister was gently interrupted by the sound of small feet descending the stairs and the sight of their son, still in his pajamas, his eyes heavy with fatigue and his face unusually somber for a bright spring morning. "Sweetheart, did you sleep at all last night?" Susan asked, her motherly instincts immediately sensing that something weighed heavily on her son's mind, far beyond the reach of ordinary childhood worries. Climbing onto a kitchen chair, Ethan's small frame looked even smaller against the large farmhouse table as he spoke with a quiet intensity that caught both parents off guard. "There's a dog crying in my wall," he said with unwavering certainty, as though simply stating a fact that no reasonable adult could possibly deny. Michael chuckled softly, ruffling his son's already tousled hair in an attempt to lighten the mood. "Buddy, that was probably just the house settling. These old places creak and groan all the time." But Ethan's eyes, wide and earnest, held none of the playful imagination his father assumed. "No, Daddy," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "It's real. She's scared and thirsty. She needs help." Susan and Michael exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations between parents where worry, skepticism, and a small stirring of unease passed wordlessly between them. They knew their son's imagination had always been vivid, but there was something different about this, something deeper, more insistent, as if Ethan wasn't imagining, but rather, sensing something neither of them could perceive. "Tell you what," Michael said, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "After breakfast, I'll come upstairs with you. We'll listen together, okay? Maybe it's just some pipes or the neighbor's dog." Ethan nodded, but his eyes remained distant, focused elsewhere, as if half his attention still lingered with the frightened creature behind his bedroom wall. True to his word, after breakfast, Michael followed his son up the wide staircase, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house, until they stood together in the softly lit bedroom where Ethan had first heard the cries. For nearly 10 minutes, they stood silently, ears strained, listening for any sound that might validate or dispel the mystery. "See, buddy? No dog," Michael said finally, his patience wearing thin as he prepared to deliver the gentle explanation of how sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially in strange new places. But Ethan raised his small hand, signaling for silence as his expression shifted from hopeful to urgent. "Listen," he whispered again, pressing his ear to the same spot on the wall, waiting with a patience far beyond his years. Michael closed his eyes, straining to hear something, anything, but all that met his ears was the distant hum of a lawn mower from a neighbor's yard down the street. "I don't hear anything, son." Ethan's lips trembled, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "She only cries sometimes," he said softly. "But she's there. I know she is." Michael crouched beside him, choosing his words carefully, trying to balance reason with compassion. "Ethan, sometimes when we move into a new house, with all its unfamiliar sounds, our minds can make us think we're hearing things that aren't really there. But I heard her," Ethan whispered, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "And she's waiting for me to help." And though Michael said nothing more, somewhere deep inside him, a small flicker of doubt began to take root, fragile and uncertain, like a seed dropped into the soil on a cloudy day. What neither he nor Susan realized then was that this small beginning, a child's unshakable certainty born in the dead of night, was only the first soft stirring of a mystery far greater than either of them could possibly imagine. And as the sun rose higher, casting long golden beams across the weathered floorboards of the old house, Susan would soon ask the question that would change everything. "Michael, what if he's right?" When Susan whispered those words, soft, hesitant, yet edged with the unmistakable tremor of motherly instinct, it hung between them like a fragile wisp of fog, neither rising nor fading, but simply lingering there, demanding acknowledgement. Michael, standing in the soft morning light that spilled like liquid honey across the bedroom floor, let out a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of his growing unease. "I don't know, Susan," he finally replied, his voice lower now, as though afraid to disturb whatever unseen presence might be listening from behind those aging walls. The house, with its century-old bones and countless secrets buried beneath layers of time, had seemed like a dream when they first walked through its creaking halls, a grand old Victorian perch just outside Cedar Falls, where the town melted into the countryside like watercolor blending into soft paper. Now, standing in the very heart of its mystery, that same house felt different, as though it were breathing quietly around them, holding its secrets just beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to uncover them. Susan gently pulled the heavy drapes aside, revealing the wide backyard where the early spring blossoms swayed in the breeze, while her thoughts raced in quiet circles, touching on old childhood tales her grandmother once told her about houses that remembered. "Michael," she said softly, not turning away from the window, "you've seen how Ethan is. This isn't like his usual imagination games, is it?" Michael rubbed his hand across the back of his neck, feeling the stiffness that always came when sleep was thin and worries were thick. "He's always had that sense about things," he admitted, his voice carrying the reluctant tone of a man who is trying not to believe something his heart has already accepted. Susan finally turned toward him, her face calm but serious, the morning light illuminating the faint lines etched by years of love, worry, and late-night soothing fevers and bad dreams. Remember when he knew about my mother's fall? Before the phone even rang, she asked, her voice gentle, but her eyes searching for his acknowledgement. Michael nodded slowly, remembering well the night Ethan had come running into their bedroom in tears long before the call arrived from the hospital. And when he told you to bring your umbrella last month, even though the forecast was clear, Susan continued, and the storm came out of nowhere. Michael couldn't deny any of it, though every fiber of his practical mind wanted to chalk it up to coincidence, to chance, to the strange way life sometimes arranges its puzzle pieces. Coincidences stack up fast with him, don't they? Susan whispered, more to herself than to her husband. And in that moment, as the old house creaked softly as though agreeing with her, something shifted quietly between them, a decision unspoken but mutual, born not of logic, but of love in the deep, ancient instinct parents carry for their children. We need to know what's behind that wall, Susan said firmly, her voice steadier now, as though strengthened by the very uncertainty that had haunted her throughout the sleepless night. Later that afternoon, as the wind picked up and the clouds gathered like silent witnesses above their rooftop, Susan found herself sitting across from an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Henderson, whose family had lived on the street longer than most could remember. They sat together on the wide front porch of the Henderson home, sipping sweet tea as the distant crows called from the trees, their voices sounding more ominous than usual under the heavy sky. "You bought the old Keller place, didn't you?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice soft but carrying that certain edge older folks often carry when their words conceal things best left unspoken. Susan offered a polite smile, though the name sent a chill crawling along her spine. "Yes, we did," she answered, watching carefully for the woman's reaction. "Though we don't know much about the man who lived there before." Mrs. Henderson's gaze drifted across the quiet street, where the tall maples swayed in the breeze like sentinels guarding long-forgotten stories. "Not many people do, dear," she said finally, her voice dropping slightly. "Robert Keller was peculiar, even before he disappeared." Susan leaned forward just a bit, her pulse quickening as she gently pressed for more without seeming too eager. "He disappeared?" she repeated softly, inviting the story forward like luring a shy deer from the woods. Mrs. Henderson nodded, her fingers tightening slightly on the delicate porcelain cup resting in her lap. "About 8 months ago now. One day, he simply vanished. No word, no note. The house sat empty after that until the bank repossessed it and sold it to that real estate company. Nobody's seen him since." The wind stirred again, sending the wind chimes dancing in a melody that sounded less cheerful and more like a warning whispered on metal tongues. Susan swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the tea. "And, did he live alone?" she asked carefully, feeling as though each answer would draw her closer to a truth she wasn't quite ready to meet. Mrs. Henderson's expression shifted, growing softer, almost sorrowful. "He had a dog," she said quietly. "A beautiful German shepherd. Named her Shadow. He adored that dog, at least at first." Susan felt her breath catch, the room spinning ever so slightly as her mind connected pieces Ethan had drawn for days now. The dog, the wall, the cries in the night. "A German shepherd," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, though her heart was now pounding like the drums of some distant, ancient march. The old woman nodded, her eyes misty as they gazed somewhere far beyond the porch, into the heavy memory of things she hadn't dared voice in years. After a while, though, well, folks said he started acting strange. He thought the dog was spying on him, talking to people through her. Some nonsense about government experiments, I think. The words fell like stones into a deep well, sending ripples through Susan's very bones as she struggled to steady herself against the gathering storm of fear and unanswered questions. When she finally returned home, Susan found Michael and Ethan in the backyard, tossing a soccer ball between them beneath the thickening clouds that mirrored the storm now swirling inside her chest. She waited until Ethan was distracted, his laughter briefly pushing back the weight of what she was about to say, before pulling Michael aside and sharing everything Mrs. Henderson had revealed. As the words left her lips, Michael's face drained of color, his hand reaching instinctively for hers as though seeking some anchor in the rising current of dread that swept between them. "A German shepherd," he repeated softly, his voice trembling as reality edged closer to something neither of them had dared to consider before now. Susan nodded, her throat tight. "Michael, how would Ethan know? We never mentioned it. We never knew until today. But he's been drawing a German shepherd for days. Trapped. Surrounded by concrete." For a long, fragile moment, they stood in silence, the wind tugging gently at their clothes, as though nature itself held its breath with them. Finally, Michael whispered the question they both feared to ask out loud. "What if?" What if she's still alive? Michael's words hung there in the quiet backyard air, not shouted nor whispered, but simply spoken with the weight of possibility neither one of them wished to fully embrace. Susan, still holding her husband's hand as though afraid to let go of her own sense of reality, took a slow, deliberate breath before answering. "I think we have to consider that she might be," she said softly, her voice steady, though her eyes shimmered with the glistening edge of unspoken fear. The wind whispered through the towering oaks behind their property, as if nature itself leaned in to listen to the conversation that was unfolding like a fragile secret beneath those old trees. Michael, who had always prided himself on rational thought and measured judgment, found himself grappling with the uncomfortable truth that no reasonable explanation seemed to account for the details they had discovered. How could a dog survive for months sealed in a wall? He asked quietly, more to himself than to Susan, his mind reaching for any strand of logic that might ease the tightening knot in his stomach. But Susan, with a mother's instinct that had carried her through years of scraped knees, nightmares, and moments of unexplained knowing, met his gaze with quiet certainty. "I don't know," she replied softly. "But Ethan believes she's alive. And somehow, Michael, somehow he knows things he shouldn't." The following morning, long before the rest of Cedar Falls had stirred from its peaceful slumber, Susan sat at the kitchen table, the soft blue glow of her laptop screen casting shadows across her face. She had decided, sometime during the long, sleepless night, that answers would not come from speculation but from searching, and the internet, vast and endless, offered countless dark corners where old stories sometimes still lived. The house's real estate listing had mentioned its age proudly, built in 1895, lovingly restored after years of neglect, full of character and charm, but there had been no mention of its more recent history. Now, as Susan dug deeper into public records, she began piecing together the unsettling timeline of Robert Keller's ownership, purchase records, tax filings, and finally, the abrupt halt of activity 8 months earlier. There was no forwarding address, no subsequent real estate transactions, no divorce filings or death notices, just a man who had simply vanished from the paper trail of existence, leaving behind only whispers and unfinished business. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Michael stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing his bleary eyes and pausing when he saw his wife's anxious expression bathed in the pale morning light. "You've been up all night?" he asked gently, though he already knew the answer before she nodded wearily in response. "I can't let this go," Susan admitted, her voice heavy with exhaustion but steady with determination. "There's something terribly wrong here, Michael. And I think it may still be living inside our home." Michael poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one before her with a tenderness that came from years of quiet partnership, and sat across from her at the table where their world was quietly shifting. "I can't stop thinking about how certain Ethan is," he said, his fingers tightening slightly around the ceramic mug. "He's never been like this before." Susan reached for his hand again, grounding them both against the storm of unanswered questions swirling around them like autumn leaves on a restless wind. "We need to check the house," she whispered. "The whole house." Later that afternoon, after Ethan had left for school with his oversized backpack and innocent smile masking the deeper knowing that lingered behind his eyes, Michael stood silently at the entrance to the basement. The heavy wooden door creaked open with a reluctant groan, revealing a long staircase that descended into the belly of the old house, where the air grew colder and heavier with every careful step downward. The basement had always unnerved him, not because of anything he could see, but because of the oppressive stillness that seemed to settle there, like a memory waiting to be disturbed. New drywall covered most of the stone foundation, remnants of the recent renovation that had given the basement its polished appearance, a modern shell wrapped tightly around old bones that had known many winters. Michael stood for a long moment in the center of the room, his breath creating small clouds in the cool, unmoving air, while his ears strained for any sound beyond his own heartbeat. He traced his hand along the smooth walls, moving methodically from one corner to the next, until he reached a section where the drywall seemed different. The texture was newer, the paint slightly brighter, the nails driven at odd angles as though someone had rushed through the task, desperate to close something in rather than finish something properly. And there, near the bottom, almost hidden behind a storage shelf, was a small vent, oddly placed, serving no clear purpose, and leading nowhere that Michael could see. He crouched down, shining his flashlight through the narrow slats, but saw nothing except the faintest reflection of something metallic farther inside, a flicker, brief and cold, that sent an involuntary chill up his spine. Then, as he knelt in that dim silence, it happened. A sound, so faint and fragile that he might have dismissed it under any other circumstance, reached his ears, a soft, labored whimper followed by the shallow rasp of breath. Michael froze, his entire body tensing as the implications crashed into him like a wave that had been building for days, now finally breaking upon his mind's fragile shore. "Oh, my God," he whispered to the emptiness, his voice barely audible above the quiet desperation that lived behind that wall. "She's here." That night, as Ethan colored quietly at the kitchen table and Susan prepared dinner, Michael finally shared what he had discovered. Ethan listened with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for the adults to finally catch up to the truth he had already known. "I told you she was there," Ethan said softly, not accusingly, but with a calm, gentle certainty that held no resentment, only quiet validation. Michael rubbed his hands over his face, trying to steady his breathing as the gravity of their situation settled heavily into his chest. "But how, Ethan?" Michael asked, his voice breaking slightly beneath the weight of bewilderment. "How did you know she was there? And how did you know she's a German Shepherd?" Ethan set his crayon down slowly, folding his hands on the table before lifting his wide, innocent eyes to meet his father's troubled gaze. "She told me," Ethan answered simply, as though explaining something as ordinary as the color of the sky. For a long moment, Michael could only stare at his young son, as though the answer he had just given was too simple for the depth of the mystery it unveiled. The air in the kitchen felt heavier now, as if even the old house had leaned in closer, listening, acknowledging that its secret was inching closer to the surface. Susan, who had paused her stirring of the evening stew, wiped her hands nervously on a towel and joined them at the table, her voice soft but steady. "Ethan, sweetheart," she began, choosing her words as carefully as one might place stepping stones across a deep and unpredictable stream. "How did she tell you?" Ethan looked at his mother with the quiet seriousness that children sometimes carry when they are certain they know something grown-ups cannot yet understand. "She doesn't talk like we do," he said gently, his small fingers tracing slow circles on the wooden table as though searching for words that fit. "It's like pictures in my head. And feelings. When she's scared, I feel scared too. When she's cold, I feel cold." Susan and Michael exchanged a glance, one filled not with disbelief, but with the growing, unspoken recognition that whatever this was, their son wasn't fabricating it. "She shows me little bits," Ethan continued, his voice steady but distant, as if recalling memories not his own. "Like when the wall feels tight around her. And she's thirsty. And when it gets dark, she feels lonely." The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked softly, marking time that no longer seemed to move at its usual pace, as though the house itself was suspended between the past and the present. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his brow furrowed with concern wrapped around awe. "Did she tell you her name?" he asked, his voice low, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the delicate thread connecting them to something neither logic nor science could define. Ethan nodded, the ghost of a small smile playing at the corners of his lips, as if comforted by the familiarity of his invisible companion. "Her name is Shadow," he whispered. "I didn't know that word before, but I heard it in my head, like a whisper that wasn't really a sound." Susan felt her breath catch again, her chest tightening under the weight of this impossible, yet undeniable, revelation. "That's what Mrs. Henderson told me," she murmured softly to Michael, as if reminding him, but also reminding herself that this was no coincidence. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling through the trees like fingers gently brushing across an old piano, while distant thunder rumbled far beyond the hills surrounding Cedar Falls. The storm that had been building for days, both outside their home and within the fragile fabric of their family's understanding, was finally beginning to break. Michael exhaled deeply, feeling as though every breath pulled him further into a world where the safe walls of reason no longer stood tall. "Then we have no choice," he said, his voice steady now with the resolution of a man who has set aside denial and chosen action instead. "We need to open that wall." The next morning arrived shrouded in low gray clouds, as if the sky itself was reluctant to witness what would unfold inside the old house that day. Michael had spent much of the night preparing the tools he would need, checking the structural diagrams left behind by the renovation company, and marking the safest place to begin the delicate task ahead. Susan stayed close to Ethan, holding his hand gently but firmly, while doing her best to keep his young mind occupied with puzzles and quiet conversation, though his attention clearly remained fixed on the basement below. As Michael descended once more into the cool, silent basement, the weight of the task before him pressed against his shoulders like a heavy winter coat he could not remove. The section of the wall where he had heard the faint whimpers the day before now stood before him like a silent gatekeeper, thin drywall masking something older, something hidden. With slow, deliberate care, he pressed the flat edge of the pry bar against the seams, easing away the top layer with the gentleness one might show to a fragile artifact lost beneath the earth. The first panel came free with a soft sigh, exposing a narrow gap behind the finished wall, a space no wider than 2 feet, running deep into the older foundation of the house. The flashlight beam cut through the dim recess, illuminating a space that had not seen light in months, perhaps longer, and revealing what his heart had both feared and hoped to find. In the far corner, huddled against the cold concrete, lay the faint outline of a German shepherd, her fur matted, her frame emaciated, yet unmistakably alive. Michael froze for a moment, his breath caught in his throat as Shadow's sunken eyes lifted weakly, reflecting the beam of his flashlight like small, flickering stars in a dark sky. "Oh dear God," he whispered, his voice trembling under the weight of relief, horror, and awe. "She's alive." The dog's chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths, and though her body was frail beyond anything Michael had ever seen, her gaze remained focused on him, not with fear, but with fragile, desperate hope. Carefully, Michael widened the opening, his hands steady but his heart racing, while upstairs Susan stood at the top of the basement stairs, her voice quivering with urgency. "Michael, what do you see?" she called, her words rising above the pounding of her heart as Ethan clutched her hand even tighter. Michael swallowed hard, forcing his voice to steady as he answered, knowing that his next words would forever alter everything they thought they knew about their home, their son, and their lives. "She's here," he called back softly. "She's alive, Susan, but barely." For several long seconds, Susan stood frozen at the top of the basement stairs, her breath catching in her throat as the enormity of her husband's words settled heavily upon her chest. The realization that her child's whispered certainty had led them here, that his quiet, inexplicable knowing had pulled them through layers of doubt into this unthinkable discovery, both terrified and humbled her. Ethan, still clutching tightly to his mother's hand, looked up at her with wide, steady eyes that shimmered with something far too mature for his tender years. "Mom," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper carried gently on the air, "she needs me now." Susan glanced down at her son, marveling at how calm he remained in the face of something that would have unsettled most grown men, and perhaps even broken them entirely. Michael's voice rose again from the dim shadows below, steadier this time, though still heavy with urgency that could no longer be postponed. "We need help down here, Susan," he called. "She's alive, but she's barely hanging on, and I don't know how much longer she can last." Without hesitation, Susan led Ethan carefully down the creaking wooden stairs, each step echoing with the weight of the moment, the air growing cooler and heavier with every downward movement. As they reached the bottom, the space revealed itself fully dim, confined, and silent, except for the faintest rasps of breath that came from the emaciated figure pressed against the old stone foundation. There she was, unmistakably a German shepherd, but little more than fur-covered bone now, her once proud frame reduced to a trembling silhouette of suffering and quiet endurance. Shadow's dull eyes shifted slowly toward the small boy entering the narrow space, as though recognizing him in some deeply instinctual way that transcended explanation or logic. Ethan let go of his mother's hand and approached with quiet reverence, his movements deliberate, his voice low and soothing as he knelt gently beside the fragile creature. "I told you I would come," he whispered, his words filled with an innocent yet powerful tenderness that reached beyond the barrier of species and language. At the sound of his voice, Shadow's tail gave a faint, almost imperceptible thump against the concrete floor, a fragile signal of hope that flickered like a single flame in the wind. Susan knelt behind her son, tears brimming in her eyes as she witnessed the quiet exchange between her child and the creature who should not have survived, but somehow had. Michael stepped back slightly, pulling out his phone with trembling fingers, his mind already shifting toward the practical, toward what must be done next to save this broken animal. "I'm calling Dr. Bennett," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "She's the only vet nearby who might know how to handle something like this." Susan nodded, her hand resting gently on Ethan's back, drawing comfort from the calm strength radiating from her son, even as the reality of the situation threatened to overwhelm her entirely. Within 20 minutes, Dr. Margaret Bennett arrived, a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, eyes sharp with experience, and hands that had seen their share of suffering. The moment she stepped into the basement and laid eyes on Shadow's frail form, her professional demeanor softened with quiet sorrow and astonishment. "My God," she breathed softly, kneeling carefully beside the trembling shepherd. "How in heaven's name has she survived this long?" Michael, still hovering nearby, could only shake his head, his voice hollow with disbelief. "We have no idea," he admitted. "But our son, He's the one who found her. He knew she was here. Dr. Bennett turned briefly to glance at Ethan, who continued whispering softly to Shadow as though their unspoken dialogue had never once broken since the first moment they sensed one another. Sometimes animals, they hang on longer than they should, when they have a reason to fight, the veterinarian murmured, her eyes reflecting a mixture of professional awe and deep personal wonder. She examined Shadow's sunken body with steady, gentle hands, noting the extreme malnutrition, dehydration, and pressure sores that covered her sides like open wounds of time itself. She's dangerously weak, Dr. Bennett said softly. But her vitals are present. That's more than I expected. If we can get her stabilized, she may have a chance. Susan swallowed hard, her throat tightening beneath the storm of emotions she could no longer fully contain. Will she make it? She asked, her voice trembling with fragile hope that teetered on the edge of despair. Dr. Bennett paused, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone who had delivered both good news and unbearable truths throughout her long career. I won't lie to you, she answered gently. She's at the edge, and it will be a fight. But she's alive. And while there's breath, there's hope. With great care, Michael and Dr. Bennett lifted Shadow from her makeshift prison, carrying her fragile frame up the basement stairs like a sacred relic rescued from beneath the earth. They laid her carefully onto a blanket spread across the living room floor, the room now transformed into a temporary sanctuary as 4 bags and medical supplies arrived from Dr. Bennett's clinic. Through it all, Ethan never once left Shadow's side, his small hand resting gently on her trembling paw, his voice whispering words of comfort only she seemed able to understand. Dr. Bennett worked tirelessly for hours, administering fluids and medications, monitoring Shadow's fragile pulse, and wrapping her frail legs in soft bandages while quietly marveling at the dog's will to live. But as evening fell and the first stars began to blink in the cold sky beyond the windows, she finally rose from her crouched position and met Michael and Susan's weary eyes. I've done all I can for now, she said, her voice steady but cautious. The next 24 hours will tell us everything. Michael nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle heavily onto his chest like stones pressing against the fragile shores of hope. Dr. Bennett gathered her things, pausing briefly to rest her hand on Ethan's shoulder, her voice warm and filled with quiet admiration. You've given her a chance, young man, she said softly. And sometimes, that's all a soul needs to find its way back. As she stepped toward the door, Michael's voice broke the quiet, filled with both gratitude and hesitation. Dr. Bennett, how could this happen? How could she have been trapped down there for so long without anyone knowing? Dr. Bennett paused, her hand resting on the doorframe, her voice dropping to a near whisper as she answered. That, she said, is the question you need to start asking your neighbors. Michael stood silently in the doorway long after Dr. Bennett's car disappeared into the dim curtain of nightfall, her final words circling his mind like slow-moving storm clouds gathering before a restless wind. He could feel the heaviness of Susan's presence behind him, her hand gently resting on his back, both of them sharing a quiet that didn't need words to fill it. The question lingered, unanswered yet undeniable, as though the house itself now pulsed with a strange new heartbeat beneath its aged wooden bones. Ethan remained beside Shadow, still kneeling on the thick quilt they had laid out across the living room floor, whispering softly to her like a boy telling secrets to an old friend. Do you really think the neighbors might know something, Michael? Susan finally asked, her voice carrying a fragile balance of caution and reluctant curiosity, as though daring to believe the impossible was becoming increasingly necessary. Michael exhaled slowly, his breath fogging slightly against the cool window pane as his eyes traced the outlines of their darkened neighborhood, where the glow of porch lights flickered like distant stars. I think, he said at last, his voice low but firm, that it's time we start learning what this house has been hiding all along. The following morning, after Susan had driven Ethan to school and Michael had ensured Shadow was resting comfortably beneath the watchful care of a visiting vet technician, they set out down the quiet lane. Their first stop was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, an elderly couple who had lived on Maple Grove Lane for nearly 50 years, their small white cottage shaded beneath towering sycamores. Mrs. Whitaker greeted them at the door with a warm smile, her hair pulled tightly into a bun, eyes bright with the clarity of someone who had seen far too much in one lifetime. My goodness, she said kindly, motioning them inside. Come on in, dears. We've been worried about you since we heard the paramedic siren last night. Susan glanced briefly at Michael. The unspoken confirmation sinking in that word had already begun to spread along the unhurried veins of small-town gossip. They sat together in the Whitakers' cozy parlor, where the scent of fresh cinnamon rolls mixed with old books and the soft ticking of a grandfather clock echoed faintly across the room. "We found something," Michael began gently, his tone respectful but deliberate, as though each word was being placed carefully upon a fragile bridge suspended between suspicion and trust. Mrs. Whitaker's smile faded slightly, her hands folding neatly in her lap as she nodded with a solemn knowing that seemed older than even her years suggested. "People have always whispered about that house," she said softly, her voice lowering as though the very walls might still be listening. "Ever since Robert Keller disappeared." Susan leaned forward slightly, her voice tender but insistent as she asked, "Did you ever meet Mr. Keller? Did you know him personally?" Mrs. Whitaker exchanged a glance with her husband, who simply nodded once, signaling permission to speak freely in the way long-married couples so often do without words. "I did, dear," she continued. "He kept mostly to himself. Quiet man. But toward the end, something changed. You could see it in his eyes." Michael's brow furrowed as the pieces slowly rearranged themselves, forming a darker shape beneath the surface of the story they thought they understood. "What do you mean, something changed?" he asked carefully, his voice never rising, as though afraid any sharpness might cause the truth to retreat. Mrs. Whitaker sighed softly, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her teacup, her eyes drifting toward the rain-speckled window as though staring backward into memory. "Robert was convinced someone was watching him," she whispered. "He told anyone who'd listen that people were coming for him, that the government had planted devices." Susan's pulse quickened slightly, her hand tightening around Michael's. "He started talking about Shadow, didn't he?" Susan asked quietly. "About her spying on him?" Mrs. Whitaker's eyes softened with sad recognition, nodding slowly as though lifting the memory required great care. "Yes, dear," she said. "That beautiful dog was his constant companion, until his mind twisted her into something sinister. He believed they had trained her to monitor him." Michael's heart sank, the weight of tragedy sinking deeper into his chest as the pattern of madness grew clearer beneath the surface of the mystery. "But no one reported it?" he asked, his voice betraying a quiet frustration. "No one tried to help?" Mr. Whitaker spoke then, his voice raspy but steady after a long silence, as though choosing his words carefully from a long shelf of regrets. "Folks tried, son," he said. "But you can't force help on a man who won't take it." And before anyone could intervene, well, he was just gone. The rain began falling harder against the windows then, like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping against glass, adding their rhythm to the haunting story unfolding in that quiet parlor. "And the renovations?" Michael pressed gently. "The real estate company who flipped the house. Did anyone ever mention what they found in the basement?" Mrs. Whitaker shook her head slowly, sadness pressing into her features like an old familiar visitor returning for tea. "They kept quiet," she whispered. "Everyone figured Keller just ran off. The company fixed up the house quickly. No one asked questions that might scare away a buyer." Susan sat back, her mind swirling beneath the layers of tragedy, complicity, and silence that now stained every brick of their home. For a moment, no one spoke, only the gentle tick of the grandfather clock filled the space where truth had now settled like fine dust upon an old attic trunk. Finally, Michael exhaled, the question burning on his lips as his voice barely rose above the rain-soaked hush around them. "Why didn't anyone tear down that wall?" he asked softly, his voice trembling under the weight of the answer he feared. And Mrs. Whitaker, with eyes heavy from years of watching neighbors come and go, gave the answer that would lead them into even deeper waters. "Because, dear," she said quietly, "they were afraid of what they might find behind it." For a moment after Mrs. Whitaker's soft confession, the room seemed to grow colder, as though her words had pulled back some invisible curtain, allowing a chill long trap to finally breathe. Michael sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles pale beneath the pressure, while the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, like quiet applause for the truths being unearthed. Susan's voice trembled slightly as she spoke next, unable to hold back the swirling question that had been building within her heart since their first steps into this unsettling mystery. "What were they so afraid of, Mrs. Whitaker?" she asked gently, her words floating softly across the small distance, like leaves carried on a hesitant autumn breeze. The elderly woman's eyes, once bright with hospitality, now reflected something older, something worn and weathered from years of carrying burdens never fully spoken aloud. "Sometimes, dear," Mrs. Whitaker began softly, "folks convince themselves that leaving certain doors closed keeps their world safer, tidier, easier to explain." She paused briefly, glancing toward her husband as if seeking permission one last time, before continuing with the quiet weight of someone finally surrendering to long-held truths. "There were rumors, you understand," she whispered. Rumors that Mr. Keller wasn't just a man losing his grip to paranoia, but a man hiding from someone. Michael's breath caught slightly, his chest tightening beneath the implications hanging between her carefully chosen words. Hiding from who? He asked, his voice low, though a growing unease now tightened its grip around his every word. Mr. Whitaker, who had remained silent for most of their visit, finally spoke, his voice raspy but steady like an old tree creaking beneath a steady wind. There were strange visitors, son, he said softly. Men who didn't belong here. Black sedans parked late at night. Folks in dark coats who never spoke a word to anyone. Susan's hand instinctively moved toward her husband's arm, her fingers tightening gently, as though grounding them both against the rising storm of unease gathering steadily in the corners of the room. Mrs. Whitaker nodded slowly, her voice barely more than a breath as she added, some folks said Keller wasn't paranoid. At least, not entirely. Maybe he really was being watched. The grandfather clock ticked softly, each passing second now feeling heavier than the one before, as though time itself hesitated alongside them, unwilling to move forward too quickly. But what would any of that have to do with Shadow? Susan whispered, her voice breaking gently beneath the mounting uncertainty swirling around them like thick morning fog. Mrs. Whitaker's gaze softened with a mixture of sympathy and helplessness, her hands folding together once more in her lap as though praying the answers would reveal themselves. I don't know, she admitted softly. But I do know that after Keller disappeared, nobody wanted to go digging into those walls, not the bank, not the renovators, not the town. Michael exhaled slowly, his mind turning over the pieces now laid before them like a jigsaw puzzle missing its final, most important image. The thought of strangers, shadowy figures who left no names and no records, hovering on the edge of their small town's quiet existence filled him with a dread he could not shake. Susan's voice finally broke the uneasy silence that followed, but the question she now carried felt heavier than anything they had spoken thus far. Do you think Shadow was put there by Keller, or by the people following him? She asked, her voice filled with trembling honesty. And as the words left her lips, Mrs. Whitaker looked down, her eyes glistening beneath the soft lamplight, as though even she feared the answer that might come next. I think, dear, she whispered finally, that you may not want to know who put her there. The rain intensified outside, as if echoing the heavy truth neither of them dared to fully speak aloud, while thunder grumbled softly across the distant hills like an old man muttering in his sleep. Michael stood slowly, his legs heavy beneath him, the weight of each word and revelation now sinking deeper into his bones like cold water seeping into an old wooden floor. Thank you both, he said quietly, offering a faint, weary smile born more from gratitude than comfort. You've told us more than anyone else has dared. Mr. Whitaker nodded once, his eyes meeting Michael's with a silent understanding between men who both knew this story was far from over. Susan followed her husband out into the rainy afternoon, her coat pulled tightly around her as the wind picked up, tossing leaves across the quiet road like restless spirits dancing. As they approached their front porch once again, their home no longer felt like the warm refuge it had once been, but rather like a place waiting for its final secrets to be unearthed. Inside, Ethan remained beside Shadow, who had improved ever so slightly under Dr. Bennett's careful care, her eyes brighter now, her breathing stronger, though the road ahead remained long and uncertain. Michael knelt beside his son, watching as Shadow gently nudged Ethan's hand, her tail making the slightest of movements, as though sensing his presence continued to be her lifeline. Dad, Ethan whispered softly, his voice carrying the same quiet certainty that had led them here from the very beginning. There's something else she wants to show me. Michael's brow furrowed slightly, his heart both aching and bracing for the next truth he feared would come from his son's innocent lips. What is it, son? He asked gently, his voice steady but weighted beneath the shadows that had grown deeper with every passing hour. Ethan looked up at his father, his small face filled with a strange mixture of calm knowing and heavy sadness beyond his tender years. She remembers something buried under the house, Ethan whispered softly. Something Keller hid, before the bad men came. For a long moment after Ethan spoke, Michael could feel the very air inside the house shift, as though the walls themselves had stiffened in anticipation of what might come next. Susan, standing just a few feet behind them, placed her hand lightly upon her chest, steadying herself against the rising tide of dread curling its fingers softly around her ribs. Michael lowered his voice to a quiet whisper, though even speaking softly could not keep the unease from weaving through every word he now uttered. Ethan, can you tell me exactly what Shadow remembers? What is it she's trying to show you, son? The boy nodded slowly, his small hand still gently stroking the dog's fragile paw, his eyes distant yet clear, as though viewing images only he could see. "It's like pictures in my head, Daddy," he explained, his voice steady and far older than his 5 years would suggest. She sees Keller digging in the basement at night. Susan's breath caught in her throat, her hand gripping Michael's shoulder with quiet desperation, as though anchoring herself against the swirl of unknowns now closing in around them. "Digging?" Michael repeated, his voice tight, his mind already racing ahead to what such a hidden act might mean in the long and tangled story unfolding within their home. Ethan nodded again, his gaze never leaving Shadow's soft, tired eyes, which blinked slowly, as though affirming each word the child carefully delivered. "There's a box," Ethan whispered. "A metal box. Keller buried it before the bad people started coming to the house." Michael glanced towards Susan, and for a moment neither spoke, both understanding that with each new layer revealed, the danger seemed to grow heavier rather than lighter. "Did she show you where it is, son?" Michael asked, his voice barely louder than the tick of the old mantel clock filling the silence of the room. Ethan's small hand pointed toward the far corner of the basement, near where Michael had torn through the false wall days earlier to rescue Shadow from her hidden prison. "In that corner," Ethan whispered, his voice almost reverent. "Beneath the floor where the old cement is cracked. That's where the box is buried." Michael swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat forcing him to pause, while the cold realization of what they might uncover rooted itself more deeply into his bones. Susan finally found her voice, though it trembled under the weight of so many unanswered questions that now pressed heavily upon her mother's heart. But what could Keller have buried that was so important, so dangerous, that he'd hide it from whoever was following him? She asked softly. Michael exhaled slowly, his hand running through his hair as his eyes drifted toward the rain-spattered window, searching for answers that stubbornly remained hidden within the shadows. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice heavy with a mixture of caution and reluctant resolve. "But I think it's time we find out." Later that evening, after ensuring Ethan was safely tucked into bed and Shadow was resting comfortably beneath the careful watch of the vet technician, Michael returned to the basement alone. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, wavering shadows across the rough concrete walls, while the familiar hum of the old furnace filled the space with a steady, uneasy rhythm. Michael knelt slowly near the cracked corner where Ethan had pointed, his flashlight beam tracing thin fractures along the surface like fragile veins beneath pale, ancient skin. With every swing of the sledgehammer, the old concrete groaned and splintered, as though protesting the secrets it had held captive for so long beneath its cold surface. The first hollow sound rang out like an unexpected knock at a door long sealed shut, sending a sharp tremor up Michael's arm as metal struck something beneath the broken slab. Setting the hammer aside, he brushed the jagged fragments carefully away, revealing the corner of a rusted, rectangular box, its surface pitted, corroded, but unmistakably intact beneath years of silent burial. He hesitated for a moment, his breath shallow, knowing that whatever lay inside this box had once driven a man to madness, secrecy, and finally, disappearance. With slow, deliberate care, he pried open the corroded lid, its hinges groaning softly like old bones creaking beneath unseen weight, until the contents were finally exposed to the dim light. Inside, neatly arranged beneath several layers of brittle cloth, lay a bundle of weathered papers, government documents, photographs, and what appeared to be a thick leather-bound journal. Michael stared in stunned silence, his mind struggling to comprehend the strange collection of items, while the unsettling pieces of Keller's tragic puzzle now rearranged themselves once more. He lifted one of the photographs first, a grainy black and white image showing Keller standing beside a large German shepherd, unmistakably Shadow in her prime, both staring directly into the camera. But what drew his eyes immediately was not Keller or Shadow, but the men standing in the background, partially blurred, dressed in identical black coats, their faces barely visible beneath wide-brimmed hats. Susan's soft voice startled him as she appeared quietly on the basement steps, unable to sleep beneath the weight of worry now consuming both their hearts. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did you find something?" Michael exhaled slowly, lifting the journal and gently turning its cover as he answered, his voice heavy beneath the realization of what lay in his hands. "Yes," he said. "I found everything Keller was hiding, and I think it's much worse than we ever imagined." Susan descended the basement steps slowly, her hand grazing along the wooden railing, her breath shallow, as though she feared what each step might reveal. The dim bulb overhead swayed gently from the draft, casting shifting shadows across Michael's face as he knelt before the open box, his eyes scanning the brittle pages of Keller's journal. "What do you mean, Michael?" she whispered, her voice trembling not from the cold of the basement, but from the rising storm of dread within her chest. Michael lifted his eyes from the journal, his face etched with a weariness that came not from physical exhaustion but from the weight of truths too long buried. "Susan, Keller wasn't paranoid about nothing," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was involved in something far bigger than we ever thought possible." Carefully, he held up one of the aged documents, a letterhead stamped with a government insignia, yellowed from years in the dark, its contents still shockingly legible beneath the flickering light. "This isn't some diary of a delusional man," Michael continued. "These are classified reports, correspondence about an experiment, something involving behavioral manipulation, surveillance, and animals." Susan's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as the unimaginable slowly took form like a shadow stretching across a moonlit field. "Animals," she repeated softly, her voice quivering. "You mean shadow? They were experimenting on her?" Michael nodded gravely, his fingers gently flipping through the pages where Keller's tightly written entries described procedures, coded observations, and unsettling references to neurological conditioning protocols. "He was recruited," Susan, Michael said, his voice heavy. "Recruited by some covert branch, something never officially acknowledged, where they trained animals to act as surveillance tools, even psychological conduits." Susan instinctively stepped closer, her hand now resting on Michael's shoulder, as if touching him might somehow tether her to reality amid the spiraling revelations now pouring from Keller's words. "But why would Keller hide this?" she asked, her voice tight with desperation. "Why bury these files? Why trap Shadow inside that wall?" Michael exhaled slowly, lowering the journal into the box as his mind pieced together the chilling sequence that now made horrific sense beneath the fragile surface of their peaceful suburban life. Keller grew frightened. "Susan," he answered, his voice trembling. He realized what they were doing wasn't just dangerous, it was uncontrollable. Shadow, she wasn't a spy to him. She became something else. Susan's brow furrowed, confusion mixing with horror as she struggled to comprehend the depth of the tragedy that had unfolded within their home long before they arrived. "Something else," she echoed softly, her voice cracking beneath the weight of the words. "What do you mean, Michael? What did she become to him?" Michael's voice broke slightly as he answered, the words falling like heavy stones into the silent room. "She became the last piece of him that was still innocent, still pure. He trapped her in that wall to keep her safe, not from others, but from the people who were coming for him." The wind howled faintly outside, rattling the old basement windows, while thunder rumbled low on the horizon like a distant warning crawling across the sky. Susan closed her eyes briefly, the horror of it all overwhelming, as though she could feel Keller's madness still lingering within these walls like smoke that refused to lift. "And what happened to him, Michael?" she whispered, though part of her was terrified to hear the answer that already felt inevitable. Michael's jaw tightened, his voice barely able to escape as he pointed toward the final pages of the journal, where Keller's entries grew erratic, panicked, and then finally stopped. "He knew they were closing in," Michael whispered. "He ran, disappeared, or was made to disappear." For a long moment, the basement grew still again, the cold air pressing against them like a silent witness to everything that had been revealed. Susan's voice, barely audible, finally pierced the heavy quiet that had settled like fog. "What do we do now, Michael?" she asked, her hand tightening gently upon his shoulder. "What if these people come back looking for this?" Michael exhaled, his eyes narrowing as though weighing every possible consequence balanced precariously upon the edge of their next choice. "We go to the authorities," he answered firmly. "We bring this to someone we can trust, someone who can protect us and Ethan." Susan's lips trembled, her breath shaky, her gaze instinctively lifting toward the ceiling where their son and Shadow rested together, unaware of the growing storm about to descend upon them. "But what if it's not safe?" she whispered. "What if they're still watching us, Michael? What if they've been watching us since we moved in?" Michael's jaw clenched, the thought sinking heavily into his mind like ice cracking beneath his feet, but he forced his voice to remain steady for her sake. "Then we bring in someone who knows how to handle this," he said. "Someone outside the system, someone they won't expect." Susan looked at him with wide, frightened eyes, searching for reassurance in the face of a world that had grown far darker than she ever could have imagined. "Michael, who would we even trust with something like this?" she whispered. And Michael, after a long pause, gave an answer that would open the door to the final chapter neither of them were prepared to face. "There's a man I served with years ago," he said softly. "His name is Harold Price, and he owes me his life." The rain had turned steady by morning, as if the heavens themselves were laying down a heavy curtain of water, sealing the small town in quiet isolation from the outside world. Susan watched as Michael stood by the living room window, his eyes tracing the rhythmic fall of the raindrops, lost deep inside the maze of thoughts that had filled his mind overnight. She approached quietly, her hand resting gently on his back, feeling the tension rippling beneath his skin like distant thunder rolling across a darkened sky. "Michael," she whispered softly, her voice carrying both fear and trust. "Do you really believe this Harold Price can help us?" Michael turned slowly, his face solemn but resolved, as though the weight of the past 24 hours had carved new lines of experience into his features. "If anyone can navigate something this dangerous without drawing attention, Susan," he answered, "it's Harold. We survived too much together not to trust him." By midday, Harold Price arrived, a tall, broad-shouldered man with eyes sharp as steel and a quiet confidence that spoke of years spent operating in the shadows most never dared enter. He stepped into their home with the deliberate ease of a man who had seen things that would haunt ordinary men forever, his gaze sweeping the room with calculated precision. "Michael," Harold greeted in a low voice, clasping his old friend's hand with a firm grip that conveyed both loyalty and urgency. "You weren't exaggerating, were you?" Michael shook his head, leading Harold toward the basement with Susan following closely, her heart pounding beneath her ribs like a frightened bird trapped in a storm. As they descended the narrow staircase, the soft creak of each step echoed like distant memories rising from the house's long-buried secrets. Harold studied the contents of the rusted box in silence, flipping through Keller's journal and the weathered government documents with a steady hand that never once trembled. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, though it carried the unmistakable tone of someone who now understood the full scale of what they had uncovered. "This wasn't just some unauthorized project gone rogue, Michael," Harold said, his voice low. "This was Black Tier classified, beyond congressional oversight. I've seen these stamps before." Susan's eyes widened, her breath hitching as the truth pressed closer, its form becoming clearer with each passing moment. "What were they doing, Harold?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What did they do to Shadow?" Harold exhaled, his jaw tightening as he prepared to speak words he knew would change how they saw everything. Everything about Keller, about Shadow, and about themselves. "They were creating biosensory transmitters," he explained slowly. "Using advanced neural conditioning, they trained highly intelligent dogs to pick up emotional frequencies from humans: fear, intent, deception." Michael's breath grew shallow, his mind racing as Harold continued, each word unfolding a story far darker than any of them had dared imagine. "They weren't just gathering intelligence through eavesdropping or surveillance equipment," Harold said. "They were using the dogs to read people, literally, to sense hidden emotions, to detect threats before words were even spoken." Susan clutched Michael's arm, her knees weakening beneath the crushing weight of the realization that the animal sleeping peacefully upstairs had once been part of such a terrifying program. "Shadow was one of them," she whispered. "One of those dogs?" Harold nodded solemnly. "Yes, but there's more. Keller wasn't their first scientist. He was brought in because the early tests were unstable, dangerously unstable." Michael's brow furrowed deeply as the storm within his mind swirled even faster, pulling him toward a truth that refused to stay hidden any longer. "Unstable how?" he asked, though his gut already braced for the answer he feared. Harold hesitated, choosing his words with surgical precision, knowing there was no easy way to soften the horror that now rose to the surface. "Some of the animals were overwhelmed by the emotional feedback," Harold said. "They started mirroring the mental trauma of the handlers: panic, paranoia, even psychotic breaks." Susan covered her mouth, tears forming as she whispered, "That's what happened to Keller, isn't it?" Harold nodded gravely, his voice low. "Yes. The bond between Keller and Shadow became too strong. Her sensory input started feeding into him, amplifying his fears until they consumed him completely." For a moment, the basement was silent again, the ticking of the old furnace sounding like a metronome marking time against the crushing weight of revelation. Susan spoke again, her voice shaking. "So when Keller realized what was happening, when he saw that Shadow was becoming dangerous to herself and to him, he sealed her inside the wall." Michael finished softly, his voice hollow. "Not to punish her, but to protect them both." Harold nodded once, slowly. He couldn't bring himself to destroy her, but he couldn't risk leaving her free. And when Keller finally broke, they made sure he vanished too. A tear slipped down Susan's cheek as she whispered, "And now, what happens to us?" Harold exhaled deeply, his eyes narrowing with resolve as he answered the question that now hung like a storm cloud above their lives. "They've been monitoring the house since you moved in," he said. "The second you uncovered that wall, silent alarms would have gone off in systems you and I will never see. Michael's fists clenched instinctively, his voice low and tight, as the full scope of their danger finally became terrifyingly clear. "Are they coming?" he asked quietly. Harold's voice was calm but unwavering. "They're already here. The only reason they haven't acted is because you haven't made the wrong move yet." Susan's breath came quickly now, fear twisting inside her like a cold hand gripping her heart. "Then what do we do, Harold?" she asked desperately. "How do we keep Ethan safe? How do we protect Shadow?" Harold's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained sharp as steel, unwavering against the storm he knew was now fully upon them. "You leave," he said firmly. "Tonight. Quietly. You take Ethan and Shadow, and you disappear. I'll handle the rest." Michael stared at his old friend, his voice heavy with gratitude and guilt as he whispered, "You're risking everything." Harold placed a steady hand on Michael's shoulder, his voice warm but fierce, like an anchor thrown into a raging sea. "You saved my life once, Michael," he said quietly. "Now let me return the favor." And as the rain continued to pour outside, masking the quiet approach of forces neither of them would ever fully see, Michael knew with absolute certainty this was the only way. They would leave behind the house, the mystery, and the shadows. But most of all, they would leave behind the nightmare that had begun long before they ever arrived. And as they drove away that night under Harold's watchful eye, Shadow rested her head gently on Ethan's lap, her eyes soft and calm, finally free from the prison of secrets once meant to destroy her. Sometimes, my friends, the past reaches forward to touch us in ways we may never fully understand. But love, and the instinct to protect, will always find a way to carry us safely home. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.